When I'm not teaching, I work on Google Translate, which is the largest provider of machine translation in the world, where machine translation is what we call automatic or fully automated translation from one natural language to another natural language. So how does it work? Well, instead of encoding explicitly all the rules of how one language might turn into another language, we instead use data that captures how language is actually used by people in the world. And that data mostly comes from the web. So if we want to translate Spanish into English, we collect a big pile of English, all of the English sentences that were ever written down and posted on the web somewhere, and that gives us what's called a target language corpus. And the purpose of having all of this data is to tell us what well-formed sentences look like. So it's okay to put the word do after the word will and build these various constructions. But it's not okay, for instance, to put these words in the opposite order. Later you see, that's just not something that's said as often as see you later. And then we also collect what's called a parallel corpus, which is examples of sentences that have been translated by a person. So if a translator's gone through and said, I will do it gladly, should be translated as yo lo haré de muy buen grado, then we record that as an example of how to translate correctly. Now the issue is that when we have our machine translation system, which is a web service, we get new inputs in that we've never seen before. Someone says, yo lo haré después. How do I translate that into English? And we've only seen these examples, which are fairly similar. Yo lo haré de muy buen grado and después lo verás are sentences that contain the pieces of yo lo haré después, but not the whole thing. So it's the job of the machine translation system to count up the frequency of various patterns in both of these corpora, the target language and the parallel corpus, distill that into a statistical model of how sentences get translated from one language to another. Now this model doesn't really know everything that a human knows about translation, but it does implicitly capture a lot of those patterns just by looking at lots and lots of variants of the same text. Because when you look over a corpus the size of the web, all of a sudden you see the same phrases being used and the same phrases being translated over and over again. You get a pretty good idea of what humans would do if they were going to translate this sentence. So this is the general picture of what machine translation does, is it pulls in a lot of examples, learns from them, and then takes in new sentences that it's never seen before and translates them by using parts of the sentences that it has seen. Now, one thing that happens in this translation system is that we try to promote syntactic agreement in various ways. So I'll describe one approach to doing this, is that for every target language sentence, we could annotate it with its syntactic structure. So let's look through an example here. I will do it gladly is what we actually see written down. But what we'd like to reconstruct is how these pieces fit together. So do it gladly is a verb phrase, composed of a verb, personal pronoun, and an adverb. And then that verb phrase is an argument to a larger verb phrase which starts with a modal verb. Will is called a modal verb, so it expresses some aspect or tense of the verb phrase as a whole. So the contents is kind of down here, but this is telling us something about how this action is being carried out. And then this verb phrase combines with a noun phrase, which has a personal pronoun I, in order to form a sentence S. So that's what we mean by some structural indication of what's going on in this sentence, and we have something similar for you will see later. Okay, so how would we actually take a novel utterance, yo lo haré después, and turn it into I will do it later? Well, we could find pieces of the input that we've seen in the examples that we know how to translate. So here we have later, translated as después, so we could translate después as later. And we would note that this is an adverb in the structure of the sentence in which we found it. Which means that when we do something similar for constructing a translation of yo hablaré después as I will do it, we can notice that it's okay in examples we've seen before to have an adverb at the end, and so sticking an adverb at the end in this newly constructed sentence might be a reasonable thing to do. And that sort of matching of syntactic categories can result in translations that have more syntactic coherence. So the piece that we removed from this example is the same kind of thing that we inserted from this example. Here's another way in which we could use syntactic structure in order to improve translation. Here's a sentence, pair added to the lexicon. I'd like to translate it into Japanese. Now it turns out that Japanese word order is very different from English word order. So in order to get this to work, I might need to know the syntactic structure of the input sentence this time. So here we have a tree that tells us that pair is the subject and added to the lexicon is a past tense verb phrase. Now, if we want to say this in Japanese, we might say pair followed by a verb phrase where the verb comes at the end instead of the beginning. As a structural requirement of Japanese that you typically put the head verb of a verb phrase at the end of the verb phrase. And a similar transformation happens with prepositional phrases. So to the lexicon, well, whatever word you're going to use to encode to will typically show up in Japanese at the end of the prepositional phrase. And the lexicon is just the lexicon. Okay, so what we have here is English still, but now it's in more of a Japanese word order. Now we got to this point by analyzing the source English sentence and noticing which parts need to be reordered before we translate them. To the lexicon got reordered, added, and then the prepositional phrase that modified it were reordered, but the whole thing was kept in the same order that it was before. Then we can just translate this monotonically, meaning without any further reordering, phrase by phrase. So pair translates into Japanese, the lexicon, here we'll translate it as something that means list, and to and added are just translated directly in order to give us some sort of reasonable Japanese translation. Now, if you speak Japanese, you might not agree with this translation, but I'm just telling you the kinds of operations that we do in machine translation in order to improve the quality so that humans find it more acceptable, even if we're still at the stage where nobody thinks that we get the right answer all the time.